Bungie finally fixed Ionic Sentry. It counts as an arc ability now, which makes it a lot more viable and works in a lot more builds. So immediately, I finally got around to finishing a build that I've been wanting to do since I heard about Heresy, and that is what I call the quad blind build. This gives you 4 sources of blind because of Vesper Radius with your Rift, Lodestar, which is the Season Pass exotic this episode, and then you also have the Ionic Sentry itself, and Flashbang Grenades. So you're just constantly blinding enemies, they can't fight back against you. You're also dealing out great damage thanks to Bolt Charge off of Ionic Sentry, and the very strong Lodestar. If you haven't used this exotic, it is extremely good. Its DPS is fantastic for a primary. It shreds through groups, you can apply Jolt, and it's just great. On top of this, we also have Arc Soul, so that we can have even more ongoing damage, and so that those frequent rifts, thanks to Vesper Radius, are giving us even more damage and letting us gun down stuff, and all that just keeps the Ionic Sentry loop going, because every ability kill gives us 2 out of 6 charges for Ionic Sentry. See here, we've just rolled through this Legend campaign like it's nothing. I think our health's barely blipped on this. And now we've got a little army between Ionic Sentry, our Arc Soul, and our Rift, and we're just going to take this boss down. That sounds good to you? Let's get into it. I'm Engineer. The main focus of this build is maximum crowd control. This build feels like an arc version of the classic Bleak Watcher build on Stasis. It's very busy, it's very active, but it's meant to lock down as many enemies as possible while also bringing a pretty strong damage component, because that's what arc does. In general, this is really good for ad clear and control. It actually does work pretty decently on boss encounters. It won't be the absolute peak boss damage, but I just did a run of Sunder Doctrine right before this to test it out. And between the Bolt Charge and Chaos Reach and weapon damage, very solid. Had no problems whatsoever. I've tested this up to 15 power level under. That's Legend campaign. That was the easiest thing I could test it on. I'm still working on power level, so a lot of the episode content or things like GMs are just a real pain to do because I don't have everything infused up. But I think this build probably actually will shine pretty well in a good Grandmaster team, because it's just going to give you so much crowd control just to keep those ads very manageable. So as for the pros, it has 4 sources of blind. I mentioned those before, but once again, your Vesper Rift, your Flashbang Grenade, Ionic Sentry, and Lodestar itself. If you don't want to use Lodestar though, you can use Spark of Beacons, and any arc special weapon will blind on kill. You get high rift uptime to your enemies because of Vesper Radius, which is a very good exotic. You have a really solid super, not the best, but it's decent. And you have good general damage output because of all the different sources of damage. And as for the cons, not the best boss damage out there, but for arc, really solid. You're kind of stacking as much as you can. If you have a boss that has no ads, the gameplay loop's going to break down. You can't recharge the Ionic Sentry without kills, so that's it. As with all arc builds, you have somewhat limited healing. You're relying on your Rift, but we have about as much Rift uptime as we possibly can. And then I list this in the cons, but I love it. Build's very active. You're constantly throwing out abilities. You're constantly switching firing modes on Lodestar. You're constantly moving and throwing things out. And some people may not like that. Could potentially be a con, but I actually love it. It's my favorite kind of builds. So let's get into it. First, our exotic is Vesper Radius. And what this does is it boosts your class ability regen speed based on how many enemies are near you. That will scale from plus 250% class ability regen to plus 1500% class ability regen if you're surrounded by 6 enemies. So that's fantastic. Now the other thing it does is it will do a arc shockwave periodically while you're standing in your rift, and that will blind enemies, and those enemies that are killed will explode, dealing arc damage. So just all around really good. This has been great for ages. The class ability regen is the best in the game, and that blind is really solid. Generally, that blind has been a little bit dangerous because it's on a rift, so you have to get pretty close to enemies, but with all the other blind in the kit, you can actually pre-blind enemies and keep re-blinding them over and over and over again, and you're still standing in a healing rift for the healing. And the buffs to amplified this episode to give it damage resistance, just to keep you really solid and safe. Our first aspect is Ionic Sentry, and this does several things. First, how you get it. It requires 6 charges, and you can get those from arc kills or kinetic kills. Arc ability kills, though, will give you 2 charges, so you only need 3 of those to get a full setup of it. Then once it's charged, it will replace your grenade. You throw it out. You still keep your grenade charged, but you'll throw it out and it will blind enemies immediately and then shoot out a blast to an enemy that's within its radius once per second for 15 seconds. Now the cool thing about those blasts is if they hit something, you get 1 bolt charge immediately, which is really strong because we have Spark of Frequency, which will turn that into 2 bolt charges for each of those. So if there are enough enemies around, and this could be a boss too because it's just on hit, you will just keep churning out bolt charge rapidly. Because it's an arc ability too, it will also activate that bolt charge, so it will throw it down on an enemy as soon as it's full, which is really solid. One thing to note is that there's a 6-second cooldown after activating it where you can't gain new charges to the next one, but out of that 15 seconds, there's still 9 seconds to work with, so it is possible to have 2 of these out. You could feasibly maybe have 3 out, but that's probably a stretch. For our second aspect, we're actually going to take Arc Soul. This does a couple things. It will increase your Rift regen when you're near allies. So Vesper Radius is going to give you regen when you're near enemies, and Arc Soul will give you when you're near allies. It's slower, but it's still really strong. What it does is it creates a little arc buddy, probably very familiar with it, and then that arc buddy is stronger if you're amplified. Pretty easy to get amplified on arc, you just need an arc multi-kill, and you're good to go. One of the best things about this though is the arc buddy will apply to allies if they go through your rift. So that is really great extra damage in almost any activity. It's really solid for boss damage. It's like having an extra person there, especially when you get up into raid activities with 6 allies. Now, one of the coolest things about this is an arc ability, so it will recharge Ionic Sentry every time it gets a kill. It'll give 2 charges out of those 6, which is really great. And that's why we end up picking it over Electrostatic Mine, which just gives us a little bit of ability energy as we do stuff we're already doing. In terms of our general abilities, Super's pretty flexible. I generally will always pick Chaos Reach. Storm Trance is pretty good for ad clear, but the build is already really solid in that regard, and Chaos Reach gives you some stronger damage for single targets. For the grenade, generally I run Flashbang Grenade. It has the shortest cooldown on arc, and it also blinds. It has an 87.5% flat gain factor, so all those grenade regen things like Ionic Traces, Bomber, any of your mods will give you more energy. Your other alternative though, say if you're doing a boss, is Pulse Grenade. That's your best total damage, and that's just a really solid grenade. But that does have a 62.5% flat gain factor because of the longer cooldown. For your melee, Ball Lightning is just absolutely the best because it has range on it. It does have a 70% flat gain factor, which isn't too bad though to deal with. Lastly, on your Rift, you really could take Empowering Rift or Healing Rift, but Healing Rift just makes the most sense on arc because we don't have a lot of sources of healing, and that can help fill that in. All Rifts have a 50% flat gain factor though, which is a huge bummer, and why that Vesper Radius class ability regen is so useful because it kind of gets around that because percent regens aren't affected by flat gain factors. Over on our Fragments, the absolute one I recommend the most, and this is very key if you do any Ionic Sentry build, is Spark of Frequency, because that will give you an additional bolt charge anytime you gain bolt charge, including the Ionic Sentry. After that, I recommend Spark of Discharge, which will give you Ionic Traces periodically as you get arc weapon kills. But the main thing here is that those Ionic Traces will also give you bolt charge. Because of frequency, they will actually give you 2 bolt charges. So that's just great extra bolt charges. Next up, I take Spark of Resistance. It's 25% damage resistance when there's enough enemies around you, and that is so good, especially with the lack of healing. That extra resistance on top of Amplified is really good. The last one, and probably the least important one, is Spark of Shock. This just makes your arc grenades apply jolt on hit. It'll let you get a little bit more ad clear and also let you trigger some things with Lodestar, so that can help, but generally not super needed. Now, some alternates though, if you find that Spark of Shock isn't as helpful for you, Spark of Ions will give you an Ionic Trace every 10 seconds when you kill a jolted enemy, and also will generate an Ionic Trace when you defeat enemies with a bolt charge. That part's pretty niche though. Bolt charges don't necessarily defeat enemies pretty consistently. Now, if you are not using Lodestar, I highly recommend an arc special weapon and Spark of Beacons, because that will make every special or heavy ammo arc weapon kill while amplified create a blinding blast, and that will apply blind to nearby enemies. It's very good for crowd control and very consistent. Briefly talking about our mods and armor stats, you really can't build into Rift with your mods because that 50% flat gain factor, it's just not worth it. So what we're doing instead is we build for orbs and super regen, and then we're gonna build for weapon damage. We take all the usual culprits for orbs and super regen. We're gonna take Ashes to Assets and Hands On, we are taking Harmonic Siphon, we take Heavy Handed and Firepower, taking a Impact Induction on the hands just to get a little bit more grenade energy out of that melee. On our legs, we just take Arc Weapon Surges and Recuperation because that's our extra source of healing beyond the Rift. And then our class item, we take Reaper to make more orbs after we do that class ability, which we should do pretty frequently. Time Dilation keeps the Arc Weapon Surges up. Then last but not least, Font of Restoration is really good if you're already running Surges. It just gives you an extra 30 recovery, so that class ability can come back even faster. This is all pretty flexible. You could end up building into grenade energy as well because it actually has a pretty high flat gain factor, and getting that grenade up will kind of keep your loop going too, but the weapon damage has really felt pretty good here and lets you flex this into boss damage pretty easily. For your stats, I recommend you max out Resilience, then Discipline, and get as much recovery as possible. This is why I'm using that font of recovery. And then try and get as much strength as you can reasonably manage and just get 30 in intellect. Over in our artifact mods, we really just want to take all the arc related artifact perks. So in column 3, that is Dielectric, which will, when boosted, anytime you kill those arc debuffed enemy kills, which we do constantly, you get an orb of power and you get health restored immediately. And because that is the entire focus of this build, that's really strong. In column 4, you want to take Flashover, which gives you amplified when you get a full set of Bolt Charge, 10 stacks, but it will also make those Bolt Charge discharges deal 150% increased damage, which is fantastic. And in column 5, there's Defibrillating Blast, which will now inflict Jolt with those bolt discharges, which is just phenomenal, and also give you 55 hit points anytime you do a bolt charge discharge. So that's about a quarter of your health just anytime you're doing that. So really strong. In other artifact perks, I've included Particle Reconstruction here. Very strong artifact perk, recommend it if you have a linear fusion rifle. And then I've also included the 2 Sever related artifact perks. Your kinetic / darkness slot is pretty empty, and Sever is very good this episode. So if you have a strand weapon with slice on it, that's really good because that normally reduces enemy damage by 40%, but with Disruptor Spike, you can take that up to 52%. So a boss is doing less than half its normal damage if you can hit it with Slice periodically. And because Slice severs when you shoot an enemy after activating your class ability, with Vesper Radius, this is just easy synergy. You also have Photonic Flare, so if you sever an enemy and kill them with arc damage, it will create another Blinding Blast, which is just one more source of blind. This actually takes 5 sources of blind, which is insane, but this one's a little bit more niche, so not going to count it. Moving over to weapons, you will see a crazy looking chart here. This is courtesy of the very excellent MossyMax. He does these great damage ranking charts for different weapon types, and the one thing he added in the most recent batch is Lodestar. Lodestar has one of the highest DPS values for an exotic primary. The only ones that are really beating it are Graviton Lance and Revision Zero with 2-round burst, but one of those is kinetic. You'll see some other values here that technically exceed it, but they're hypothetical ones, like an exotic heavy burst hand cannon, which we don't have, and then sidearms. I don't know if we have exotic versions of these sidearms, but the limitation of sidearms is their range is much smaller, whereas Lodestar is basically like a sniper. You can shoot stuff from across the map. So very, very strong damage. I was a little bit medium on this at first, but I saw this damage chart and I'm like, I've got to try Lodestar, and this build's perfect for it. Why is it perfect for it? Because our goal here is to get even more blind and add some jolt in. So Lodestar's from the Heresy Season Pass, and it's the best option for this. So when you kill arc debuffed enemies while aimed down sight, it will create a blinding blast. It's basically like a free spark of beacons, as long as you can kind of start the loop off by debuffing at least one enemy. As you fire it and deal damage to enemies, you get a special fire mode called Arc Alignment. And when you activate that just by doing a special reload, if you hip fire it, it will inflict jolt on enemies. So you can just hip fire, sweep across a bunch of enemies, inflict jolt, and then you can aim down sight so it drains slower. Generally that mode, your biggest goal is to inflict the jolt on a few enemies just to keep the loop going, kind of restart that loop internally. A couple other things to note here is that the aim down sight mode does 30% increased damage to arc debuffed enemies, which is phenomenal because we do that so much. It's important to note that blind on bosses, even though it doesn't actually disorient them, still counts as them being debuffed for things like this, so that's very solid. If you don't want to run Lodestar, you have a few other options. As I mentioned, you want to use Spark of Beacons and use an arc special weapon. So you have Cold Heart from the base game, Delicate Tomb, Witch Queen. You can also use Edge of Concurrence. The formerly Hunter exclusive glaive is now everyone's exotic glaive. It's very strong, good arc. Synergy has jolting feedback built in. And then if you don't want to take an exotic at all, Indebted Kindness from Warlord's Ruin is really good with Volt Shot. And then much more recently, the Warlord's Spear from Iron Banner with jolting feedback is really good too. Now in your Kinetic and Darkness slot, yeah, you're pretty flexible. There's generally two options here. You can take Lost Signal, which is a stasis area denial grenade launcher, because area denial grenade launchers are very good at building up bolt charge. Just throw it on some enemies after you have one bolt charge stack, and then it will kind of do everything for you. But I personally like going with strand weapons with Slice, because those are good for Sever. You have a few great options here. Scatter Signal from Season of the Wish is really good. You can take the Call from the Pale Heart, and then we also have some primaries as well if you want to pair those with a arc special weapon. So you can use Adamantite from this episode, Better Devils from Crucible, and I'm sure there's probably a few more. Definitely look into it, see if you can find one that works for you, but you have a lot of good options for Sever these days. On your heavy, it's really flexible. Just take whatever you need for the encounter. I usually use a machine gun or a grenade launcher. Really can't go too wrong here. We're in a pretty solid heavy meta. I did mention before particle reconstruction. If you can fit in a good linear fusion rifle, that can also be really solid. Just wanted to show you a longer gameplay loop. So this is the opening of Contest of Elders. It is a pretty chaotic encounter with a lot of enemies and a lot of fire, so I wanted to use it as a good demonstration of this. What you can kind of see here is I found some cover with arc. Because you don't have a lot of healing, you need to manage the damage you are taking. If you run out in the open a lot where enemies can shoot you from different directions, you're done. Now you can see here there's some elite level wizards that spawned. I threw an Ionic Sentry out, immediately blinded them, and they are just floating and stumbling around. That one's finally thinking about fighting back, and it's already dead. Thanks to Lodestar. Just churns through it. Got another Ionic Sentry out, and it's just shooting thralls as they rain down from the sky. I'm so glad they fixed Ionic Sentry. It is a really cool ability. I was so disappointed on launch, but it does feel pretty good now. I still do wish they would make it a arc grenade ability, so it could take Spark of Shock and work with Spirit of work with Verity's Brow, but I will take this over what it had before. Yeah, so here you just want to keep throwing out the Ionic Sentry, just keep looping your abilities. Generally playing a little close to enemies so that you can get that extra class ability regen for your Rift. You can see we've already got our super here pretty quickly. It's been a little bit over a minute, but not bad at all, especially not even using like Geomags or anything, and it's not a roaming super. You just get it back pretty quickly because of all the damage. Exotic primaries are really good at generating super from active super regen, so that's part of it here for sure. That Flashbang Grenade is really good for dealing with like elites like that. Just throw it out there, blind them, and then you can kind of manage it. Kind of moving around just to make sure we can get some of these other enemies here, so we are still maintaining some good cover, making sure we're not turning our back on too many enemies. Having to kind of watch that health bar a bit. See a Bane enemy comes out, and we just switch that arc alignment mode on and just burn him down. That hipfire mode does some really solid damage if you just need to burn something down and can't necessarily aim at the head. Shoots very quickly, but burns through your ammo pretty fast because of the burn speed on it. I really like throwing out, when you have kind of a boss like this on the field, just anytime you get the Ionic Sentry, just throw it over by him. It'll build up bolt charges, and then it'll just throw them at the boss itself. So it's a really good way to chip the boss down. I think we've got the boss below half health, and we haven't actually really fired at him at all. Yeah, he's down to about a quarter of health, and he's dead. That's pretty much it. Just gotta crush the ghost. Just to go over the gameplay loop. At the beginning of fights, cast your Rift for Arc Soul and Blind. Start fights with a flashbang if they're not blinded by the Rift. Aim down sights and fire Lodestar for damage, and it will do a blinding burst if those enemies are still blinded. That'll keep kind of chaining through the field. As Ionic Sentry comes up, throw it out on groups to get more blind and just start building up that bolt charge. And then just mix in your melees and grenades and use your super as needed. And that's pretty much it. You just keep repeating that. Just spam your abilities and keep everything blinded and stumbling around so you and your team can have a nice, easy time. And with that, that's pretty much it for the build. I'm just going to bring back up that build review just so you can kind of see the overview of it. Overall, I feel like this build's really solid. It's really fun to play with, very active. It's got good crowd control. Maybe not the best damage, but lots of sources of ongoing damage, which I think is one of the real strong suits of Warlocks. I hope you give this a try. I'm really glad that Ionic Sentry is working now. I will probably be seeing about some other builds with it too, but this was the one that I was most excited about and I think had the most potential. I will link the dim link and the Mobalytics link in the description. These slides will also be down in the description if you're not aware, so you can refer back to them for quick reference without having to watch the video, though I do appreciate any views you can give me. I will also link to MossyMax's post so you can see those damage charts yourself and see if there's any weapon types you've been neglecting or any that haven't been feeling good, and you can now see why. And with that, I will let you go. Thanks for all the support. I really appreciate it and all the growth on the channel. And feel free to leave me any notes in the comments. And I love talking about builds. I hope to have a lot more coming to you soon. I have many builds built up right now and no intent on stopping anytime soon. So look forward to it. Thanks. Have a good one.